Now, if you like drama, then you will love Micah chapter 6, because what we have here, very simply, is a courtroom drama. And in any courtroom, of course, the natural place you would expect to find God would be the position of the judge. But actually, that's not the scene here, because in this court case, God is the prosecuting attorney.
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. I'm David Pick, and Colin, today we have God trying to convict people.
That is exactly what we've got in Micah in chapter 6. It is an extraordinary courtroom drama in which God appears as the prosecutor, and he's actually bringing a case against his own people. And when he brings the case, they've got absolutely no defense. And that is our position. If God were to come and to make his case against us, we have absolutely no defense whatsoever.
What about all the good things I've done?
Doesn't matter how many good things a person has done. When you come to court of law, it's not the good things that are being judged. It's the particular offenses that are being brought as the case. And so when God brings our offenses, which have to be dealt with in some way, shape, or form, when he brings them out, we are left without defense. So thank God that later in the book of Micah, we have this marvelous statement that God has buried our sins in the depth of the sea. That's what he's done. When I stand defenseless before God, my hope is in Jesus Christ. But being in Jesus Christ, he does call us to a different life. And that's what we're going to see here in the book of Micah today.
So join us in chapter 6 of Micah as we begin the message, The God Who Sends Out Subpoenas. Here's Colin.
Well, as we come to Micah in chapter 6 this morning, we come to what is probably one of the best known verses in all of the Old Testament, and certainly one of the most important, Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. It's perhaps the best known verse in the whole of the book of Micah, and it really is the clearest statement of what God requires from his people. If you want to know the kind of life that God is calling you to lead, you won't get a better summary than this. Micah 6:8. What does God require of you? And the answer is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Now that's where we're heading this morning. The best way to understand the significance of this very, very well-known verse is for us to look at the whole chapter and for us to see the message that the Lord is giving to his people here. Now, I do hope that you'll have the Bible open in front of you, because you'll be able to see as we move through this chapter what it's all about. It's a very dramatic picture. You'll see from verse 3, if you have it open there, that God is responding here to certain things that his people have been saying about him. Notice verse 3, my people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. So evidently these people had come to a place where they felt that God had placed unreasonable burdens on their lives. And I guess we all have times in our lives like this. Something goes wrong for you or for your family. And you say, well, what is God doing? He's allowing an intolerable burden in my life. And sometimes we feel that God has let us down. Well, that's how it was in Micah's day. These believers, they weren't happy with God. They were complaining, God has let us down. God has given us these great burdens. God has made our lives difficult. God's not coming through for us. Now, God's people have been making all these charges and accusations against him. And what happens in Micah in chapter 6, very simply, is that God counters by bringing a case against his own people. Now, if you like drama, then you will love Micah chapter 6, because what we have here, very simply, is a courtroom drama. And in any courtroom, of course, the natural place you would expect to find God would be the position of the judge. But actually, that's not the scene here, because in this court case, God is the prosecuting attorney. God is the plaintiff, if you like. God is the one bringing the case against his own people. You see it there in verse 2. The Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. So now let's think through this court case that runs through the chapter together. First of all, the witnesses. Now, if you're going to bring a case, you have to have witnesses. And in this case that God is prosecuting against his people, he brings some very remarkable witnesses indeed. Look at verse 2. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. Now, the point here is quite simple. God had hundreds of years before made a covenant with his people. And when that happened, God spoke about the heavens and the earth being witnesses to that covenant. You find this in many places in the Old Testament. One example is Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 19, if you want to follow through, where God lays out two ways to live for his people. There's a way that will lead to blessing, a way that will lead to cursing, a way that will lead to life, and a way that will lead to death. Then God says, Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, on this day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. The idea here, you see, is that as God speaks and as the people make their vows in response back to him, that the heavens and the earth are the witnesses. They heard these words, as it were, God's promises to his people and his people's promise to God. And so now that there is this case that comes up with regards to God and his people, the heavens and the earth standing as witness to this covenant, God sends out the subpoenas and he calls the witnesses, as it were, into his court. He's bringing a case against his people. Now, it's worth pausing here for a moment to say that being witness to a covenant is a serious business. Perhaps the most obvious situation in which we see that happen, it happens regularly right here on this platform. In a wedding, you have a bride, you have a groom. You have the groomsman, and you have the bridesmaids. Now, why do we have the groomsman and the bridesmaids? We know why we have the bride and groom, but why do we have the rest standing up here? Well, is it simply to make the front of the church look more colorful? Is it so that the bride has someone to hand the flowers to while she makes her vows? Is it so this guy who stands here can fumble in his pocket at the time not already having the rings in his hand? No, there's much more. The groomsmen and the bridesmaids are witnesses to the covenant. Now, think about what happened when you were a groomsman, or perhaps if you were a bridesmaid, if you've had that opportunity at some time in your life, even if it was 30 or 40 years ago. Think about what happened. Your friend, the groom, made some vows. And you were standing right there beside him when he did it, close enough to see him sweating. Your friend, or perhaps it was your sister, the bride, made vows. And you were standing right there beside her, close enough to feel her trembling. Now that gives you a big responsibility. Because there may come a time, you see, when things aren't going so well in their marriage, 5, 10, 25 years later, and the bride or the groom may get the idea that somehow they could do better. And that's where the witnesses come in. If you were at the wedding, you are in a position to hold your friend, the bride or the groom, accountable to their promise. That's, by the way, why it's good to have someone of your own age group standing with you in a wedding, because you need someone who can hold you accountable to your promise, perhaps long after your mother and your father have died. He said he would love her, cherish her, honor her, keep her. Is he doing that, your friend? She said she would love him, cherish him, honor him, keep him. Is she doing that, your friend? Now, you see, the whole idea of witnesses, and the very reason why we would have a wedding in public, indeed, as we're talking here this morning about what a covenant means, the idea is that there should be accountability for following through on serious vows of commitment that are made long after the tuxedos have been returned to the clothing company. So if you think your job is over when you send back the tuxedo, you have not understood what it means to be a groomsman or a bridesmaid. So if you're planning a wedding, think carefully about who you choose as your witnesses. Your groomsmen and your bridesmaids, talk to them. Sit down with them and say something like this. Tell them what it means to be a best man and a bridesmaid, and say to them, now look, I am going to make a vow. It's the vow of my life, and I'm deadly serious about it, and I want you to hold me accountable for the rest of our lives. And if you ever see me wandering away from it, here's what I want you to do. I want you to give it to me straight. I'm asking you to commit yourself to that right now. And if you are a witness to a covenant, you have a responsibility to do what you can to see that that covenant is fulfilled. You have a special role in supporting this marriage, as indeed every member of the wedding party does. You see, God's plan is that there should be a community around every marriage to support the fulfillment of vows that are made. It's not a private thing, you see. It's a marriage. And there may come a time when you have to say to your friend, you know, I heard you say, till death us do part. I was standing right there with you when you said it. And that courage and that true friendship might just save a marriage. Now, God's covenant with his people, this ultimate covenant, of course, was made to continue from generation to generation. And because it continued from generation to generation, I mean, who could remain then as the witnesses? Well, the angels in heaven are witnesses, but God calls the mountains, the heavens, and the earth as witness to the covenant promise that he made to his people and that his people had made to him. Remember, of course, the covenant was cut at Mount Sinai, the mountain, you see. God came down to the mountain. And the point here seems to be that if God's sacred promises to his people, or their sacred promises to him, were ever to be broken, the very mountains, the heaven, and the earth itself would be shaken. So that's the witnesses.
And that's where we'll have to pause for just a moment. You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called The God Who Sends Out Subpoenas. It's part of our series, Close Encounters with the Living God. And if you ever miss one of the series or you want to go back and listen again, do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk, and there you can listen to any of the messages which have already gone out on air. You can also find us as a podcast. Follow the link from our website or by searching all the major podcasting sites for Open the Bible UK. Back to the message now. We're in Micah and chapter 6. Here's Colin.
Now, the evidence in this trial comes in two parts. First, that the Lord has kept his promises to his people. The Lord has kept covenant. Look at verse 4 and 5. I brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam, and so on. God is reminding the people that going back generations, their fathers and mothers were slaves. If it had not been for the Lord, that would have been their lives too. But God stepped in and brought their parents out of slavery in Egypt and brought them into an entirely new position of blessing and of prosperity. The Exodus, of course, was the definitive act of God in the Old Testament that changed everything for his people. And again, it points forward to the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is the definitive act in the New Testament that changes everything for those who come to him, releasing us from slavery to sin and death and hell and bringing us to an entirely new position in Christ. Now God says, I've kept my promise. I've kept you. I have provided for you. I have kept covenant with you. Whatever the difficulties of your life, those who are in Christ know that this is true. And it's good to remember that God's covenant is established by grace. It wasn't that the slaves in Egypt sort of negotiated their release through God. How could they have done that? No, it was God that reached down from heaven and just saved them. This is the kind of God he is. So the first thing that's established in the evidence is, look, I've kept my covenant promise. Here's the second thing. God's people have broken their covenant promise to him. Now you find this in verses 9 to 16. Where God speaks specifically about the sins of the city. And in this, he is referring especially to sins that are rooted in the business world, the sins of the city. Listen, verse 9, the Lord is calling to the city. Am I still to forget, O wicked house, your ill-gotten treasures? Now, you see, he's talking as he brings out evidence in this case about the way in which folks in the business community have made their money. Some folks had become pretty wealthy, but God has questions about how they made all this money. Now, this comes pretty close to home. Some of us have done pretty well in business, but there are situations in which you may feel uncomfortable about how you made that money. You look back at some of the things that you did over the years, decisions you made, and your conscience isn't entirely clear. Things weren't as straight as you would have liked them to be. It was complicated. Now, that's what God is speaking about here. And he gets pretty specific. Verse 11, shall I acquit a man with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? You know, of course, in those days that trading was done, buying and selling, using balancing scales. You put the weight on the one side and the commodity that's being bought or sold in the other side until they balance. And the way in which the weights were done was simply with stones that would be marked up according to their weight. And you'd have a 1 pound stone, a 2 pound stone, a 5 pound stone, and you'd carry them around in a bag. Now, the bag of false weights that is referred to here would be a bag of stones that was wrongly marked. So in other words, you would take a stone that really weighs 1.5 pounds and you would mark it 2 pounds. Then you put it in the scale, and someone comes to buy barley or whatever it is, and you pour the barley into the scale. The scales balance at 1.5 pounds. You charge the person for 2 pounds. They go away thinking that they've got 2 pounds of barley. Actually, they're only carrying 1.5 pounds in their sack. Now, this was the sort of thing that was rife in the world of business then, which in different ways it is rife in the world of business today. There are hundreds of us here who go out every day of our lives into the world of business to make our living. And you know that it's a jungle out there. You experience this pressure every day of your life, and it is intense. Competition over contracts, and therefore the pressure to cut corners and shade truth. Trying to match bids with unscrupulous competitors. Large companies building a position that will force others out and get rid of the competition. Look at verse 12. Speaking about the city, God says, her rich men are liars and their tongues speak deceitfully. Does that sound like business in Chicago today? It does, doesn't it? See, why is it that the days of trusting a man's word or a woman's word in business are so long gone? Why do we need these endless contracts with every detail? Because we got to cover every possible way in which someone else might creatively imagine they can do you over. We can't trust because there isn't integrity. Now, let's summarize then what we've learned here. God's people have been grumbling and complaining about the burdens of their lives. God's failed us, they say. Now, God's listened to this long enough, and he says, now, wait, the time has come for me to bring my own case against the people, and he calls the mountains, the earth, and the heavens as witness. He lays out the evidence. Now, look, I made covenant promises to you, and I've been faithful to them. You made covenant promises to me, and you've broken them. So while the people have been going around moaning and complaining, saying the Lord's failed us, the reality is actually completely the reverse. The truth of the situation is we have failed the Lord. So the prosecution rests its case. Now, what about the defense? Well, you can read Micah chapter 6 a few dozen times. You won't find any. There is no defense. I mean, let's face it, what is the case for the defense? There is none. What defense could we possibly bring? I mean, is there anyone here who wants to make the case that the business world in Chicago is a shining model of integrity for the world? Well, you see, no one was ready to make that case in Jerusalem either. There is no defense. So what do you do if you're facing a court case and there is no defense that you can offer? Plea bargain, right? Plea bargain. Now that's exactly what happens in verses 6 and 7. It's all about plea bargaining because, and notice this is very significant, there is an awareness of guilt here. Folks are coming to the point of saying, okay, I know that everything in my life isn't as it should be. I'm going to concede that. Well, now let me find, how can I get my way out of this situation? Let's negotiate. Let's plea bargain. Notice that here we're talking about offerings and sacrifices for my transgression, for the sin of my soul. There is an admission of guilt here, an acceptance of responsibility. So these words in verses 6 and 7 are really the words of someone who kind of holds up their hand before God and says, okay, you've got me. You got me. I'm guilty. Okay, I've not been straight. I've dodged, I've weaved as I've made my money. Sometimes it's on my conscience. Okay, you got me. You got me. I'm guilty. Now what do you want me to do? With what shall I come before the Lord? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves a year old? Isn't it interesting that when we feel guilty, there is an impulse within us to become religious? Have you noticed that? A bad conscience will make a man religious, very often. Burnt offerings, sacrifices. I made a lot of money. I don't really feel at peace about all of it. So maybe I could give something to the church. Or maybe I should do some work in the church. Or maybe I should do some work in the community. Maybe some voluntary service in the community. I can give something back that way. I'll feel better about what I've taken out.
That's human nature, isn't it? When we don't have a defence, we want to plea bargain, to negotiate, or work out our own solution. You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith, and today's message, The God Who Sends Out Subpoenas. It's part of our series, Close Encounters with the Living God, and if you've missed any of the series or you want to go back and listen again, you can do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk, or by finding us as a podcast, and those are available on all the major podcasting sites by searching for Open the Bible UK. Also on our website, you'll find Open the Bible Daily, and that's a series of short daily reflections, 2 to 3 minutes in length, based on Pastor Colin's teaching and read in the UK by Sue McLeish. Open the Bible is supported entirely by the generosity of our listeners, and we want to thank you for supporting our ministry in that way. If you haven't previously supported Open the Bible, but you'd like to begin doing so, we'd like to thank you by sending you a copy of Kevin DeYoung's book, Impossible Christianity. It has a very long subtitle. The subtitle is Why Following Jesus Does Not Mean You Have to Change the World, Be an Expert in Everything, Accept Spiritual Failure, and Feel Miserable pretty much all the time. Colin, how did the book help you?
Well, it brought a fresh sense of peace to my soul. The problem is that sometimes we put burdens on ourselves that God never intended us to carry. We all know that we never do anything perfectly and that none of us is perfect. But what we can lose sight of is that it is actually possible to live a life that is pleasing to God, and that acts of faith and hope and love really are pleasing to Him. And Kevin DeYoung brings this out in a beautiful way that I think will bring a sense of relief to the souls of many people who read this book. And that's why I'm really excited that we're able to share it this month. It was immensely helpful to me, and I think that it will be immensely helpful to everyone who reads it, especially people who have a tendency to put too great burdens on themselves.
Well, we want to send you a copy of this book, Impossible Christianity by Kevin DeYoung, as a way of saying thank you for your financial support this month. If you're able to set up a new payment of £5 per month or more to the work of Open the Bible, we'd love to send you this book. Full details of this on our website, and you can give online. For Open the Bible and Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope we'll see you again next time. What really matters to God? Discover how it's not your religious practices next time on Open the Bible.